Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on when you're watching this and where in the world you might be. But welcome to GM Chat here on Artifacts Worlds Wide. I am Jeff, longtime game master, mostly dungeon master. And my co-host here.
I am Michael Christian. I am a most time GM and sometimes Dungeon Master.
Yep. And our topic for today is world building, because it's something that both of us have tried our hands at. We've both run games in a world that we've created, and it's a lot of work.
Well, thank you for captioning the obvious.
Yes, it is a lot of work, but for myself, I can speak. I think that it's like a boatload of fun. I mean, like a lot of fun.
I'm enjoying it, I think. I'm still in the it's a lot of work phase. I can say it's work that I enjoy. Sitting down to write up new adventures or expand sections of the world that I hadn't really gotten into yet. That's kind of fun. But man, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is. The thing, I guess I've heard there's like two different approaches to doing this kind of thing. One is the micro and the other is a macro. And that's, the micro is you start your campaign in a small town and you kind of flesh the town out as they go up in levels and invest more into the town they're in. And then as they get higher in levels and they go beyond the town, then you can sort of, with each campaign, expand from there, and it just kind of builds out. The other is the macro, which is kind of where I started with mine, where you take the entire continent. Well, I actually took an entire world, and try to think in general what is where and how it sits and what the climate is and this and that. And going back to my old college geography course and, trying to draw on some of that. But that can be daunting.
Oh, yeah. So you went macro.
Macro.
So
yes.
you started with the map.
Yes.
I did too.
Yep, I started with the map. It was I had an idea in mind of how I wanted the whole thing to work. If in hindsight, if I had it to do over again, I would start with a micro, I think, because I had a definite city that I was going to start everything in. And it's a massive city with a lot of things going on. And because I started in the wide world, I probably didn't or haven't put enough detail in that particular city that I should have and would like to. So, like I said, going back, I would prefer to start just with the city, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I literally started with the map. I found, and this is one thing, there's going to be a lot of shout outs today, because I don't know about you, but I'm going to be talking about the software and the websites that I've used as well.
Oh, definitely. I even made a note on the one I want to use.
Yep. I found I was like just doing a general search for mapping software or map creation software, and I stumbled on a website called Incarnate.
Yes, yeah. I've been using that myself.
And
Very, very cool site.
that, I was immediately so impressed that I bought access to the program and just started playing around with it, and through just learning the interface, I ended up creating a Caffin.
Yeah, I started, I started just using the private notes in D&D Beyond's campaign thing. From there, I was introduced to OneNotes, and that's kind of cool. It's a little clunky, but it does what you need to do when you start really expanding your continent and your cities and species and all of that stuff. But then found worldanvil.com, and just a bloody brilliant site if you want to world build, and not just if you want to build for a tabletop RPG. If you're writing a novel or a group of novels or something like that, and you just want to keep good notes and stay consistent, it's great for that. Just it kind of takes one note and completely organizes it, restructures it, streamlines it, and it's fantastic. I can't talk enough about World Anvil. It's great.
Now, you said you started with the idea of a city.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know before you started designing the map generally where that city was going to be in this world?
All I really knew geographically, I knew that it was a port city. So I knew it was going to be, on the ocean or a sea. I hadn't really mapped out where on a map it was going to be. I did know that it was a actual sort of a temperate climate, not quite tropical, but because it does have winters and stuff like that, just not, it's very moderate, a moderate swing of its climate. So I knew it was going to be a port city, and I knew that it was going to be forests, mountains, but also on the sea. So, my first thought in drawing a direct comparison is it would be something like maybe Portland or something along those lines, Oregon, or even upstate California, something like that. But that's all I had when I first came up with the idea of the city. Where did you start with it?
I really started sort of creating the topography first. Like, I knew that I was creating a section of a continent, that there's a lot more to the world than I'm starting with. And once I had the topography, that sort of dictated where cities and villages would pop up. And, a couple islands, clearly those were going to be, something significant because, if there are decent islands, people tend to build things on them. And the first city that I created would end up being the capital, Erma, and that too is a port city. But I was using sort of random city creation sites just to try and get ideas. And the one site that I was using, which one was it? Yeah, I'm not seeing it at the moment, but it kept creating cities that were port cities that were also on rivers. And so I looked at my map and realized that I had the ocean on the east. I had a big lake over here. The ocean curled down around the bottom edge of this section of the continent, and the river came through to the lake and then back out to the sea again. So I'm starting to look and going, okay, so where would be the big port city? And that ended up being right on the mouth of the river. And as I sort of developed things, I realized that for me, the river was going to be more important than the sea to this particular port city. Because of the size and the distance involved in traversing the land, the river was going to be crucial to how people would get around and move merchandise.
Mm.
So really,
Like
it was the topography that sort of told me, okay, where's the most important place on this map? It's got to be here, and that ended up being the capital city.
Gotcha. So you've at this point really only come up with sort of the main continent area, or actually just a country.
Yeah, I've basically, the way I liken it is I've probably come up with the equivalent of the eastern half of the United States.
Gotcha. Yeah, see, I went for broke on I've got the entire continent and the different countries, how they're split and broken up. And for the most part, now I have most of the governments that these countries run and what they're set up like, what the relationships are between each other. Oh, gosh, that's just insane to try to deal with all of that.
Oh yeah, the section that the only other continent that you really can see any part of is where the quote-unquote enemy is. Mm. And as far as the map, that continent doesn't have a name yet. The only named place is the port city that the people on the continent discovered, and that's Yarsalthu. Mm. And that's the port city where the bad guys who live on that continent have already launched an attack once.
Let's call them the enemies, because in their world, they're the good guys, not the bad guys. We're the bad guys.
That's true. Well, just for anybody who's watching Lands of Akathan, that's where the orcs and the dragons come from. So, and that was fun. Figuring that out, I was like, okay, I'm a big fan of R.A. Salvatore and the Drizzt books, and Clan Battlehammer up in the north and all that sort of stuff. And I read through the whole series, which was like their big orc war. And I started thinking, okay, yeah, you know what, orcs can be badass. But then I thought, yes, but there needs to be something even worse than orcs. And so the orcs are working for I don't even know what you'd call it. It's a clan of chromatic dragons.
Enclave or something?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, why not? I mean, what's worse than an orc? Let's run across the whole, vast span of what could be worse than an orc, and then end up at the very end of the line.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know if I would actually say dragon is the worst. because demons and devils are pretty badass in their own right.
Which brings me to another question I had about this. What did you do about races and species and so forth? Because that's something that I've definitely made a conscious effort to kind of make my own in my world.
Yeah. One of the things that really sort of influenced me on that one was the fact that I intend to publish this world at some point. And so I was, reading through the open gaming license and looking and seeing, okay, what can I use? What can't I use? And I wanted this to be compatible with 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. But I also wanted it to be, compatible with Pathfinder. And so I'm looking at the OGL and thinking, all right, what I ended up doing was simply going through the OGL and saying, okay, this is what exists in this world. This is what doesn't exist in this world. There are no drow in a cabin. There are the tieflings are almost not known. They're so rare.
Cryptids.
Half orcs and what I call dragon kin, obviously. Those have only popped up in the world in the last half century as a result of the after effects of the war with the orcs and the dragons.
Mm-hmm.
So basically I kept the main races. I just went through and said, okay, this works for the world history and the cosmology, this doesn't, so it's gone. And that's not to say that there isn't a subterranean species. There is. It's just original.
So I know in your campaign you opted to go with just core player's handbook options.
Right. Primarily because that's what's in the OGL.
Okay.
OGL
Right.
covers the basics of the player's handbook and the monster manual and the DMG. So anything outside of that material, I would need to create myself if I wanted to be able to publish.
Gotcha. See, I have the luxury of not having to concern myself with that with my world. So I can have anything and everything.
And that, let me tell you, that is a luxury.
The drow in my world, first of all, aren't called drow. They're dark elves. And they are not inherently evil because their deity is not evil. They're culturally are probably, well, not probably, they're culturally as a species the most intelligent beings on the planet. Their deity is the goddess of wisdom and logic. And so culturally, that's what they strive to do and be, and have, as a result, they're the top minds on my world. And they have both underground and above ground cities. And they're not inherently weakened by sunlight, but they look in every way like a drow, but they're not hated, scorned, ridiculed, anything like that. In fact, they're sought after for their wisdom and intelligence. But I just didn't want to I didn't want to be locked into tropes. The orcs in my world aren't necessarily evil. They are definitely xenophobic They do not like encroachment. They're very territorial. And they operate more like a barbarian clan than they do civilized society.
That tracks. Yeah.
Yeah, and they are very nasty physically. They're far more resilient and powerful than the monster manual would have them.
A little bit more like how they were envisioned in Tolkien.
Yeah, they're very much like Uruk-hai, exactly. But and the other luxury I have is if I see something that I think looks cool, whether it be in a video game or YouTube or something like that, and I can make a cool monster out of it, I do. So as some of you have been privy to in some of my past games with that world, some of those monsters are very creepy and very nasty.
Yeah, I've had a lot of fun writing the creepy because in addition, there are basically two species in Icathan that replaced the drow. One of them, the players have not directly encountered. I haven't encountered at all yet, and they're the ones that live below ground. But there's another, I guess you could call them species, that lives above ground that you have encountered. The one thing they have in common is that they're all some shade of white.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I just call those horrors.
Yeah.
Because they don't necessarily see themselves as a culture. They are... and I can't even remember what they were called, but I remember there was a villainous race that was introduced in X-Men back in probably the early, maybe mid 80s, that just showed up and devoured everything. They were just voracious. They were ruled by hunger. And that memory kind of influenced the horrors a little bit. Except what they hunger for is fear. That's what literally they feed off.
Well, that definitely tracks with your sensibilities. You're certainly a zombie file.
Yep.
But
yep. Now I have a question for you, if you don't mind. How did you arrange sort of the political relations between the races in your world? Because, in traditional Dungeons and Dragons, you have, each race has sort of a stereotyped view of the other races. And, like humans generally think that, dwarves are grumpy and elves are haughty and hobbits are, flighty and gnomes are weird and, and, that's been built up through decades of D&D.
Sure.
How did you arrange the race relations in your world?
Well, the process was simply, as I decided that I was going to use this race culturally in the world, was how are they generally perceived? And I went with some tropes, like, for example, the elves. The elves are they have a superiority demeanor. They, and this is in general, this isn't every elf, but in general, elves believe they are superior, and they are. They're extremely long-lived. They have, which affords them many opportunities to grow, learn, and uh, uh, become more knowledgeable. They're highly skilled at magic, highly skilled at combat. Culturally speaking, they're fairly superior in them terms. The difference, well, I don't even know if it's a difference. I think this might be in general most elves in most worlds, but in mine for sure, they have that feeling. They understand that they're probably more superior than most species on the planet. The difference is they don't treat other species as though they're lesser. They know what they bring, what they have to offer culturally or whatever, and they're fine with that. And that's kind of how I approached it. I sat down and just started, okay, well, how in general does the elves feel about themselves culturally compared to the rest of the world? How do they feel about the rest of the world culturally in terms of influencing them? So that's kind of how I approached it. And I kind of took each race and did that. Now, one thing I haven't had in my world at all yet are dwarves. They have not made an appearance yet. I've not had any players that have played them. So I haven't quite gotten to that yet. It'll be an interesting thing. But some of them I have gotten to. The orcs, for example, I have sort of their thing, and humans, of course. I have a multicultural city that has every walk of intelligent creature on the planet that live there. It's a melting pot, literally, just this, extremely diverse city, has every religion in the world propped up. And it functions fairly well. It's ruled by a council of representatives for each religion and each species, and so everybody gets a fair say. So I have those sorts of things going on, and by and large, everybody gets along okay. There's no elves and dwarves or have friction. I don't really have anything like that. It's mainly just people or countries or nations that want to exert or expand their borders, and sort of, that's the only time that things in the world tend to get nasty.
In a Cathan, everything is in the view of a nation in recovery. They were recovering from the event known as the Shattering, which was bad enough that there are practically no records. They just know that civilization was almost destroyed. And so they've been working to come back from that. Then the orcs and the dragons attacked, and the elves and Ecathan are a refugee race because their homeland has been destroyed and taken over by the horrors. And that's that Isle of Thath-Toxun that pops up every so often. So in Ecathan, it's really more of a survivor mentality. So it's kind of, this is a little cliche, but it's kind of the idea from movies, like Independence Day, that we all have our warring factions between nations until some sort of massive enemy from beyond shows up, and then everybody bands together. And that's still the mentality across most of the Cathan. The inclusion or the appearance of half orcs and the dragonkin have created the only real racial dichotomy anywhere in the world, because it's kind of split down the middle how those two species are viewed. I mean, neither of those species asked to be created. They were created out of war. But part of the populace views them as victims, and so they view them with sympathy. The other part views them as potential security risks, and they view them with suspicion. But at the same time, you have both half-orcs and dragonkin that have risen to positions of prominence. They're not common yet, but they're there. And they're in between the normal, like the standard races: human, dwarf, elf, gnome, halfling. There's no tension. They all consider themselves Acathans. The mayor of the capital city is a dwarf. And, he's the head of the army as well. So now, you brought up something that made me think, I want to ask about this. How did you create your pantheon of deities?
Hang on a second. I was having some connection problems. I'm going to
No, all right.
get my hotspot going here, just in case.
Probably not a bad idea. Yeah, we made it through 4-hour game last night with nobody losing connection. I think that's a first.
Yeah, it's been really wonky this morning, so I was prepared.
Sure, got to make up for it,
But yeah, it's been doing fine up until now, our broadcast, but all right. So deities. Before we get started on that, if anybody's listening and you want to send in something in chat, please send us a question or comment.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
we will attempt to address it.
Yep. I'm watching chat, so if somebody says something, I'll see it.
So as far as deities go, that was probably what I struggled with the most. Initially, I was going to have a pantheon that was set up in a rank and file system where you had your greater deities. You had your top seat, who is 1, then your greater deities, and then the lesser deities, and then the demigods. And I thought, rather than come up with all of them, I would come up with the core and just sort of take it from there. And if one of my players had an idea that they wanted to worship a deity of, the desert, then I would think of something that would apply, and we would do that. But as it turns out, I haven't really needed to come up with any more deities. I have 5, and they sort of broadly represent different, domains. But then I have one of those 5 is the head of the pantheon, and he's lawful good, the god of justice,
and who has a brother who is also a deity, who is the god of vengeance. So they're sort of two sides of the same coin in that regard, just different philosophies about how to, you know, cope with retribution of some kind. The others, she's the goddess of magic and war simultaneously. You know, and the other one is the goddess of nature.
Mm-hmm.
And then the drow, who is, you know, logic and wisdom. And then no, that's the 5.
Yeah.
So recently I have thought of their
let's call them angels.
Mm-hmm.
But in that, I have a tiered system. There's a rank that goes, you know, intercessor to, you know, the next level. There's 4 tiers. Now, intercessors are interesting in my game in terms of my religion. If you are a follower of a god, and by follower I mean you're an active clergy,
Okay.
or champion, paladin, that follows a deity, that deity, from the onset of your career, assigns you an intercessor. It's an immortal being that they grant that is only for you, and they only care for you. And the reason I did that is because the gods do not interact with the prime material. They don't come there. They're not allowed to. They aren't allowed to speak to or interact with their subjects. So they give them intercessors. And I found that it's a fantastic way to give the players a little insight and a little assistance when needed to move them along when they kind of don't know or aren't sure what to do. It's a great method of doing that. And I've had a lot of fun coming up with these immortals because they're quirky and a lot of fun to play with.
Reminds me of I can't remember the name of the character, but the voice of God in Dogma.
Yeah.
Yeah, for mine, for a Cathan, I thought about the fact that, you know, this is a world that literally was shattered, and what that would have meant for the gods of the world. And basically, backstory that, you know, no one playing really needs to know, but just kind of what went on in my head was the shattering actually destroyed the gods of the pre-shattering world. But those divine forces can't be destroyed. And they coalesced into the current pantheon based on, go a little Jungian here, based on the collective subconscious of the people who live on the continent.
Gotcha.
And I kind of borrowed from Kryn, from the Dragonlance setting for this. The idea that there is sort of, there's 3 pantheons. There's the gods of good, the gods of neutrality, and the gods of evil. For each pantheon, there is a god who has prominence. And then there are 3 gods that also fall into that pantheon but are not as powerful as
Right.
the main god. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was you said that your god, your like big main god is lawful good and a god of justice.
Yeah.
I have a god of justice too, but in the Acathan pantheon, that god is the head of the neutral pantheon. But in Acathan, I paired justice with balance and judgment and death, because I see justice as being logical.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of let the punishment fit the crime sort of thing. And I see that more as something that would be tainted by preponderance of feeling to one side or the other of the scales of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you justify having your god of judgment be lawful good?
Well, if I had went with your interpretation of it, I wouldn't have needed my god of vengeance in that capacity. The two of them are sort of syncretic in that, or symbiotic maybe in that way, and where they serve the same motivation, but they each have different philosophies about accomplishing it. He's lawful good because that's what the deity deems law is about. Its law is supposed to be for the good, for the greater good, for society, and that's how he feels. Whereas his brother, the god of vengeance, feels that anyone who has been wronged deserves to be vindicated, deserves to be to get their vengeance. They deserve to have that exacted, and the whole religion is founded around that notion. Typically, the clergy of this order, their whole intent is to do that, and typically have their own vengeance to be gained. And so far, it has been a very, very interesting thing, because one of my players is a cleric of this god, and she has a deep desire for vengeance, that for what she's been wronged with in her life, and has well on the way of exacting that vengeance, and as a result has become closer to her deity. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, but that's how I sort of deal it. They're very absolutes of the notion of each of these domains. They're not the definition. You know what I mean?
Yep. And that I get it now, and so I sort of see you decided that your sort of main ethical pivot was going to be justice versus vengeance.
Yes.
In Acathan, it's protection versus destruction. Selflessness versus selfishness.
Right.
So, interesting.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's pretty interesting. I have a wild card now in the game with the onset of a new deity, but that's going to be an interesting, literally wild card. It's going to be, none of the other deities are none too amused by having this upstart who sort of looks down on all of the other deities with contempt. So it's going to make a lot of fun in my world. But
Now it's interesting that you talked about your intercessors.
Yeah.
Because again, kind of going with the model that Weiss and Hickman came up with for the Dragonlance world. In Ecathan, the gods occasionally will reach out and interact directly. They may not reveal who they are in that interaction. I can say for sort of, insider info that the players in the Ecathan campaign have already encountered one of the gods. Because
Really?
this god has taken a particular interest in what these 3, now 4, are doing.
Interesting.
Yeah. But not in a way that reveals that interest. Because, as a deity, they're very aware of how, wigged out people get if they realize they're talking to a god.
Right.
So, kind of like, this is horrible because I can remember the assumed name, but I can't remember the real name. The Paladine. I did remember. Paladine, the god of the main god of good in Kryn, actually traveled with Tasselhoff for a while as Fizban the wizard. That absent-minded wizard who was constantly going, let's see, I knew a spell. The battle's going on, I knew a spell. Fireball, how did that go? Oh, yeah. Boom. And that was a great character. I mean, obviously, it's been probably 20 years since I've read those books, but Fizban came to my mind immediately because there's so much storytelling potential in that if it's done well, and I'm trying to do it well, it's going to I hope it's going to come as a massive surprise if and when the players ever find out who the god is.
So you mentioned that you have that your world has a history.
Yeah.
Did you start with the history, or did you kind of come up with the history after you came up with the setting itself?
To be honest, I still don't know what happened before the shattering and what caused the shattering. We're not to a point yet where that's important. I do know there is going to come a point, because I've already got that plotted out. I have certain major events that I know are going to happen periodically. So the way I've written the source book is that once this is all said and done and the book is released, people will be able to play in either the first, second, or third age in Ecathan. And those are going to be separated by some of these major events. But there is one of the events that probably I'm thinking is going to be the transition from the first age to the second age that I'll need to know by then. I'll need to have figured it out, because the players are going to encounter creatures who have been around since before the shattering, and they're going to know what happened. So at that point, I will need to know too. But no, pretty much for at least the beginning of the game, I focused on, here's what's happened to create the society that exists now.
Right.
But
in my case, at least with the nation, which is where I started, where my city is in, I have not as ancient of a history as yours, but it does have a history, like with a couple of 100-year history. And and I kind of started with that, where it was the city existed during this time, but it was a slave city. It was enslaved by this ancient red dragon who lived in the mountain behind the city. And he pretty much ruled the continent unchallenged, because there was no one to challenge him. There was a group of adventurers who took him on and defeated him, killed him. And from his horde, it was so vast, they literally financed the country, and still 200 years later are living on the means of that horde. So that's kind of what the history of my city was, and where the country came from. But that's kind of the only thing that I've got in terms of history. I'm sort of creating the history now, and then maybe at some point I can go later and everything that's happened globally will be history for a new campaign.
Right.
But
now I've got a question that's just kind of personal to me, although, it may be something you've thought about too, because I know we're both musicians. What role does music play in your world? Like, what role do bards play?
Okay. Not a fan of bards. I've never had a desire to play a bard. I've never really cared or had a desire to have them played in my games. Until 5e came out. The 5e bards are pretty freaking cool.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah. I look forward to getting a chance to play one someday, because I've always loved bards, even back from first edition.
However, to answer your question, music and or bards in this world, I haven't thrown a whole lot into it, other than they exist. Music exists pretty much on the same level as your generic D&D world does. I haven't really thought much about it. Well, it's not true. I have had a bard play in my game, and she was pretty cool. But other than that, I think I kind of would like to, in thinking about it, I'd kind of like to have whoever's playing a bard put their own style on what it is they do, within the limitations of you're not going to be playing a Gibson Les Paul through a Marshall stack.
Right.
Doesn't exist in the world, but
right.
Yeah, so I haven't really put much into it yet.
Yeah, in a Cathan, I set up something. One of the things that really sort of opened my eyes to this type of setting was reading the George R.R. Martin books.
Okay.
And recognizing just how slowly communication moved from one section of a large landmass to another, and how that lack of information ended up leading to, horrible things happening that wouldn't have happened if people had just known that such and such had already occurred over here. And in a Cathan, I wanted to do something to sort of remedy that. So I created the Far Signal Network.
Right.
And so they have the ability to, using something along the same ideas as Morse code, They have the ability to sort of relay messages across the continent. So information that otherwise would take weeks to get there can get there in a matter of hours. Kind of like a very, very, very primitive magic-based telegraph.
Right.
But that is for the merchant class and for the governments. Bards are how news gets to the average person. Because the bards spread the songs that talk about things that happened in certain places that are important to know and remember.
Sure.
And so the bards are almost the journalists of a sort. They are definitely the storytellers.
It sort of reminds me of the Italian Renaissance era of art and what role it played. Because they were retained sometimes and hired to do artwork for the church. Because at the time, most people couldn't read.
Yeah.
They were illiterate. So they would have Bible stories depicted in artwork so that people could see it and get the gist of what the Bible was teaching. And so in that way, art was used to inform. And that kind of sounds like what you have in mind with this. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah. That's just the general idea because, like I said, I've always loved bards. Even back in the day when it was virtually impossible to become one.
Yeah.
Anybody who never tried to make a bard in first edition, you had to get to a certain level of fighter first. I think it was like level 7. Then you had to start over as a thief and get to level 5 as a thief. Then you could become a level 1 bard.
Right.
And fortunately, that was the only edition where they, hamstrung bards like that. Starting in second, you could just choose bard as your class. But even back then, I was like, oh, I want to do this. I want to get to be a bard because, that's cool. Music and magic, that's...
That's you.
Yeah. I've always loved that idea.
So we have a little bit of time left, not much.
A couple minutes.
Magic. Is there anything unusual in your world concerning magic? Or is it pretty much just, straight D&D spellcasting?
The only thing that's really unusual magic-wise is the fact that obviously, given the state of the world, there are no draconic sorcerers.
Okay.
If you follow the sorcerer's path, you are following the path of wild magic.
Gotcha.
And that made a certain sense to me when I was trying to figure out arcane magic in the world. It was like, okay, here are the people who do it by formula, the wizards. Here are the people who do it by patron, the warlocks. The sorcerers would be the ones who literally just grab raw magical energy, throw it, and try to shape it as it's flying.
Gotcha.
And, so far we've only, we've got a character in the group who's a sorcerer, and so far we've only had one time where the magic got away from her. And fortunately, it worked out. It was whatever spell you're casting has max effect. So it was a positive thing. But, some of the stuff that I'm writing right now for the next big story arc after the Thunder's Edge stories, one of them is going to revolve around wild magic. Because that too is something that I've always loved. I've always loved having a character. My dream character was, I think, in 3rd edition, I had a bard who had a wand of wonder.
Mm.
And so, and his attitude was literally, right, here's the next song, boom, Wand of Wonder. What happens?
Right.
That's what he writes the next song about. If it's cool, but otherwise, it's Magic as written for 5th edition.
Yeah, mine is pretty much the same. It's as written, with this caveat, for any resourceful or adventurous spellcaster. Magic in this world is just a phenomena of power. It's an energy source that is available, the same as electromagnetism, radiation, or anything like that.
Sure.
So how you harness it, there are, in the past, people have learned to harness it and create different manifestations, which is where your spells come from. But there's nothing that says you're limited by that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, you come up with a cool idea for how you want to use magic. Myself as the DM will take a look at it and say, okay, this is how we can do it. This is what level you'll be able to cast it. And this is how much it's going to take and cost you to do it, to get it figured out. It's nothing new under the sun, but it is something that is available to players to work on and come up with. And I have some unique spell abilities that are kind of rare because, they're not, broadcast, but in the game that are powerful, and they're kind of nasty. So that's kind of how I handled Magic. One thing else I've done with my Magic system in this game that we never used to do all through our years and years and decades of gaming is I've gotten into using spell components.
Oh, yeah.
And it's kind of an interesting game mechanic. So, yeah, that's how I do it.
Yeah, I know that for a long time, for 3rd and, well, not really 4th, but for all the time we've played 3rd edition, my house rule was that we didn't go with memorization slots. We went with a spell point system.
Spell point system, yeah, right. That's right. I remember that.
And I had thought about incorporating the spell point system into a Cathan, but I decided against it. Because pretty much what I've seen is that 5th edition is probably the most balanced of any of the editions of D&D, and so I kind of didn't want to mess with it. 3rd edition is imbalanced, so I don't mind, plugging in a whole new magic system.
High-level fighter takes, 4 or 5 attacks per round and just does a butt ton of damage,
Yeah.
So a spellcaster, can do the same in your system. But
yeah, well, and they can do the same in 5th.
Well, now the way they have it,
and that's another reason why I didn't feel the need to plug the spell point system in, because it is nicely balanced. I think the only possibly imbalanced element I've seen so far is rogues and their sneak attack.
Well, yes and no. At lower levels, they're devastating. Once they get into higher levels, they can still do a lot of damage, but they're not one-shot kills anymore.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of, our sorcerer hasn't really cut loose yet.
No.
And when that happens, you're going to find out, okay, the rogue is kind of,
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a very interesting discussion because, yeah, I mean, we've both played in each other's worlds, but we've never had a chance to talk about this.
Right.
About actually the
We
creation.
had another
of it.
hour to talk about it.
We could probably fill that, but
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. If you've got any suggestions for topics that you'd like to hear us, long-windedly expound on, we're happy to do that.
I'm good at that.
And be sure to check out all the other offerings that we've got on Artifacts Worldwide's here on Twitch. Tonight, we're going back to the Star Wars universe. We'll be playing Star Wars The Old Republic and role-playing our way through it. So, 2 Sith and a grumpy bounty hunter.
Sounds like a sitcom.
Yes, it's the new vehicle for Steve Guttenberg and Ted Danson.
Sure.
And then Sunday, we will have Board Remotely. This Sunday, we're going back to World of Warcraft.
Right.
With you and I and Pam and Nikki.
Mm-hmm.
And then Monday is... I forget what they call that show. This
Board
is horrible.
Remotely?
I'm going to have to look it up.
Board remotely?
No, player chat.
Oh, player chat. Oh,
Yep.
Okay.
Monday they'll have player chat with Pam and Nikki. And Tuesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern U.S. time, we're going to jump back into the lands of Acathan for the next chapter in the adventure. They're headed out of the capital city, headed to a part of the country they've never been before. And they're starting it off with old friends, so that's going to be fun. The captain and crew of the Clever Sprite, the
Yes.
magically powered paddle boat that serves the river route between Costed's Wave and Erma. So, we hope we'll see you again. Until next time, play well.
See you later.